one of the things that we get a lot from our viewers, because Chalk Talk is a viewer-based Q&A with the viewers, is what about the Christmas tree being called an idol? Do you have anything to say about that before we close this out?
I mean, I think the important word there is idol. Let me just, like I said, we did a whole episode of this on my podcast. People can look up and listen to it in detail. But the short version is that the idolatry element is significant. And what I mean by that is, if you go back in the Old Testament, they were never supposed to make a graven image of things in the earth or in the heavens or under the earth and all that sort of stuff. But they do. They make cherubim, don't they? And they make it at God's command. Did God break his own law? Well, no, because the issue was worship. Okay?
Right.
The issue was worshiping those things. The cherubim were fashioned to be either the seat or the footstool of God. Okay, what you were worshiping, what you believed was present in the Holy of Holies was the presence of God himself. God essentially sat on these things. They were subservient. They were not the objects of worship. So you take that analogy to things like Christmas trees. What you have going on with trees and some of the other trappings of Christmas is the early church, and I mean like the late antiquity. What they were trying to do was they were trying to take holiday or seasonal customs and somehow attach them to spiritual realities of the New Testament. They essentially became sort of like visual aids. To teach certain points. And they used these things for evangelism. So they weren't using trees, and nobody in the early church said, hey, we need a tree so we can worship the tree instead of Jesus.
Right.
No, they would take a custom and say, okay, we will use this as a visual object lesson to talk about, the fate of the one who was born on this day and what that meant for humanity. Now, that was the motivation. The motivation was actually evangelism, trying to convert the pagans and things like that. And we can look at that and say, oh, that was a good strategy, or that was a horrible strategy, but nevertheless, that was the strategy, and the goal was conversion. The goal was not, how can we be more pagan? The goal was, how can we make the pagans Christians? And again, we can criticize it tactically, but as far as the motive, it's very misguided, to look at the presence of a Christmas tree and saying that's a seduction, to paganism. That wasn't the motive then. I don't know really anybody, who's a practicing Christian now that sets up a tree and bows down to it or offers something to it. So it's there. Yes, you could walk into your house and abuse it and do something silly, to turn it into an idol, and that would be bad. You could be bad with anything. It'd be bad with your phone, your iPhone, or whatever. But that wasn't the intent back then, and it certainly isn't the intent back now. So I don't think that we need to turn it into an idol by the way we talk about it. Because that's what often happens to people. They begin to look at these things and they begin to think, either silly thoughts or idolatrous thoughts, or that I'm going to get rid of all this stuff and this day is going to be like any other day. It's an extreme option. If you want to get rid of that stuff and maybe do the Jewish stuff, again, by all means, what's important is that you remember the day. That you remember, and again, not a calendar date, but you remember that this actually happened in real time. And I think we should be glad that there are other people who remember it with us, especially if they're Christians.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Especially if they're Christians, but even if they're not, even if they, in our day and age, it's wonderful that they even respect the day.
Yeah.
Because we're transitioning now from a post-Christian culture to an anti-Christian culture. So, you could even use the day itself for pre-evangelism, just, foster a good relationship with your unsaved neighbor. Maybe it could be an evangelistic thing.
Yeah.
But to turn it into something abhorrent, I think, is really misguided.
Yeah, it's kind of like those straw man arguments that we were talking about before recording that, to say that, and this is just my own opinion here on this matter, but to say that every Christian who puts up a Christmas tree is setting up an idol in their house and they're spiritually abusing their children and stuff because of it. I think that's a straw man, and I don't think any Christian actually believes that. I don't think any Christian is actually looking at or treating the Christmas tree as an idol, just like you were saying.
It's a way to present yourself as being more spiritual than your brother. You're not really sincerely trying to have a conversation or to, engage someone with, well, look, what do we really know about the date or not? This kind of, in other words, it's not an inducement to Bible study. What it really is it's putting a stake in the ground and saying, I'm more godly than you are.
Yeah.
Which I would say is basically always a mistake. It's always evidence, I think, of a lack of humility at the end of the day.
Yeah, and that attitude comes out pretty clearly.
If you want to do that in the privacy of your own heart, again, just remember the day. However you want to do that. And if you don't want to do these things, wonderful. But to use this as some sort of hang out a shingle, a spiritual shingle, then I think you have a heart issue.